who was an undergraduate in our program, and then, you know, went away and did her thing. She did her degree as an undergraduate was in anthropology, but also in museum and curatorial studies. And so she contacted me. I was kind of watching for contact from her, see how she was doing, and she contacted me to say that when I provide a letter for an application, she was thinking of submitting. And I basically said, why? Why would you do that? Nothing against the program she was going to apply to. I just thought she would be a perfectly good fit here. And indeed, we have found that. It's actually a bad habit of mine, and Kate may recognize this impulsive mind. But why? Why would you do that? Anyway, so Zsofia has been interested in a long time in the issues that she's going to be talking to you about. And she sort of kind of famously, as an undergraduate, doesn't know what I'm going to say, did a project in Lindsay Bell's class on visual anthropology, which was an ecology of cursive writing, which was a short film that she made. And it was visual, but it was also about the intergenerational transfer of knowledge. And so some of those kinds of issues around teaching and learning continue, you know, they just keep morphing in her work. And so she's got a beautiful project she's working on that she will talk about.
You should just be able to use the arrow key. Oh.
Did I make the start? Is that fine? Okay, great. Thank you, Kim. Nice. So yes, my presentation today is titled Teachers' Work, Learning and Teaching About Difficult Knowledge in Ontario Schools.
Do you want me to advance it? Is that easier?
So for a little bit of the roadmap of the presentation, I'll be covering the context and research directions, background, methodology and theoretical approach, and some emerging topics. Kim did provide some context, but I thought I'd provide a little bit more. So I have academic and work experience in both anthropology and art, and specifically in the art, culture, and heritage sector. In these experiences, I was always interested about how emotionally challenging content or difficult knowledge is presented to a general audience through exhibitions, educational programming, and community engagement. And so in my original MA research proposal, I wanted to study both museum educators and teachers. But as I embarked on the research, I found a lot of information with teachers, so I decided to stick with that. So right now I'm focused primarily on grade 1 to grade 8 teachers, elementary teachers in Ontario. So you can ask, why teachers? Well, teachers in Ontario occupy a key position in learning and teaching about emotionally challenging topics in their educational environment. In foregrounding their experiences, I'm interested in how they select topics, manage, coordinate, and facilitate discussion about difficult topics inside and outside the classroom. And with this research, I hope to contribute to educational anthropology, difficult knowledge studies, and approaches in institutional ethnography, which I will discuss. And within this, an aim is to understand how people are navigating within constrained spaces and how they creatively navigate their situations for action. Part of the research also explores democratic teaching practices, so all the challenges and possibilities of this kind of work. So the study might be helpful in outlining strategies and resources for teachers who are interested in doing this kind of work in Ontario, but also for educational associations that do work in educational design, curriculum development, and educational policy. So to set the foundation of the presentation, I will define 2 key terms that I use in my research, which is difficult knowledge and institutional ethnography. So difficult knowledge is a term meant to signify both representations of social trauma in curriculum and the individual's encounter with them in pedagogy. So difficult knowledge involves and implicates both the individual students and teachers, as well as the curriculum and pedagogy as they encounter together different media texts. So this could be film, narratives, stories. And difficult knowledge is an invitation to think about pedagogy from the vantage that it complicates it, of the vantage of the complications it introduces for teachers and students. So it invites us to think about how these topics operate at the level of affect and emotion. And I really like Sarah Ahmed's definition of the relationship between emotion and difficult knowledge, which is how emotions work to shape the surfaces of individual and collective bodies by reading texts that circulate in the public domain, which work by aligning subjects with collectives by attributing others as the source of our feelings. Blocking anyone. So by engaging with difficult knowledge as a process of engagement, we can see how teachers are navigating teaching about difficult knowledge to students from different lived experiences, backgrounds, and knowledge bases. But in the interviews, of course, teachers don't refer to this as difficult knowledge, but rather as sensitive topics, challenging topics, social justice topics, and controversial topics. And some of the key topics that were highlighted were the ongoing legacy of former Indian residential schools, Islamophobia, gender-based and sexual violence, ethnic conflicts, LGBTQIA2+ rights, and poverty and homelessness. So the second term is institutional ethnography. And IE is a method of social inquiry developed by Dorothy Smith. She's a Canadian sociologist, and anyone who's worked with Kim probably has heard of her. We love her. We love her. So it's to learn from people of their everyday lives and how their doings are coordinated with the actions of others. So we can turn to language to understand the organization of social relations in a particular time and space. Part of organizing social relations can include texts. And in institutional ethnography, texts are defined as texts that are replicated and available to more than one person and at different times. The curriculum is an example of how an institutional text coordinates and governs the work of teachers, regardless of the geographic region they work in, and has continued to shape teaching strategies throughout time. So teachers have to work within the guidelines and parameters of the curriculum, but they exercise ways to work with and against the curriculum to meet their needs. So in this framework, texts are active in coordinating everyday activities and perform a role in connecting these activities as ruling relations across space and over time. So the guiding question of my work is, how are teachers navigating institutional relations to select, introduce, create, and manage discussion on difficult knowledge topics in their educational environment? So this is my methods timeline. From May and ongoing, I'm doing document analysis. June to September, I did social media observations, and June to October, I am completing and finalizing open-ended interviews. So for my step one of my methods is document analysis. So in the institutional ethnography framework, elementary school teachers have the expert knowledge of the grade 1 to grade 8 education system in Ontario. This knowledge allows them to coordinate efforts to introduce difficult knowledge topics in the classroom or in the school. But what kind of knowledge is central for them to achieve this coordination? Framed within institutional ethnography, texts play a central role in this, and the curriculum is an active text to understand how teachers are coordinating their activities in the educational system. Just like I said previously, the curriculum structures and governs the work of teachers, but they exercise ways to work with and against it, which I will also talk about later. So with this in mind, document analysis involves examining the grade 1 to grade 8 social science, history, geography, and language curriculum, and equity and inclusion resources from district school boards. My step 2 is social media observations. So they're completed on 2 platforms, Facebook and Twitter. As social media is an increasingly popular medium for teachers to share thoughts, resources, and ideas. So through the lens of institutional ethnography, social networks and these posts can also function as active texts. While the posts on Twitter and Facebook circulate differently compared to the curriculum, they impact how teachers coordinate efforts to select, introduce, and manage discussion on difficult knowledge topics. So these posts are active attempts to align actions with other people who have shared goals within the context of the institutional text. So since June, I've analyzed over 300 posts from Twitter and Facebook using textual analysis, which I will give an example of here. So this is an example of a Twitter post that I analyzed through textual analysis, which basically is giving contextual information as it relates to the research questions. So in this example, we have the topic of addressing racism, the emotional work involved in it, and how the curriculum as an institutional text connects to that. It also, some other key information is how this information is disseminated. And we can see that it's used through a hashtag. And hashtags are, so hashtags are basically mechanisms that filter and curate specific content on different platforms. And you can also see that this educator is tagging or mentioning another individual. It's not identified, but you can see by the @ sign. And this shows the flow of information and how they're sharing resources and opinions. So my step 3 is open-ended interviews. So I'm still in the process of completing them. So open-ended interviews are a type of interview that are less structured and depends mainly on the participant to guide the conversation, which is really important for my work. So far, I've completed 11 interviews, hoping to complete 15, and each one are 60 to 90 minutes. Among the participants, I have both retired and active teachers, and their active teaching years range from 1977 to 2002. So this is a map of Ontario, our province, so among the participants, they are mainly located in southern, eastern, and western Ontario, and I'm hoping to reach more north. It's hard to reach north because of where the district school boards are located, but a little bit more north. And so far, participants cover 9 district school boards out of 72 in total. And the public education system in Ontario is structured that has 4 publicly funded school systems, which is English and French. And among that, it's either Catholic or public. So in institutional ethnography, mapping social relations is a really important way to understand how text governs the work within institutions. So we can see here that within this, the teachers are in the middle, and they're navigating the expectations and the structure of the curriculum mandated by the Ministry of Education, all the way down to administration. Also, we see that the actual work conditions are governed by their agreement, which is the collective agreement, another text. Also, there's a role of publications that are informed teaching practices in Ontario, produced by the Ontario College of Teachers, which is the professional and accreditation body of teachers in Ontario. And they're also managing expectations from community, students, parents. And I want to point that media, particularly social networks, plays an interesting role, because not only teachers are not the only actors that can use those sites, everyone can. It was interesting to see which actors can enable and constrain the work of teachers. I did add an onion because these get really complicated. I'm a visual learner, as Kim mentioned, so I like to think visually, and this has helped me understand kind of where texts come into play in institutions. If you actually saw an institutional ethnography map, it's basically illegible and it's really hard. So I hope this got the point across. So while I'm in the process of collecting my data and analyzing it, since it's quite early, 3 topics have emerged that I wanted to discuss today. That, these have come from my own understanding of the research, but also the methods and theory. But I want to point out and emphasize that these are not findings, but these are mainly just topics that I'm interested to look further in my analysis. So the first topic is the institutional effects of curriculum. So as I highlighted earlier, teachers are working with and against the curriculum, as the curriculum is an institutional text that governs their work. But what does it mean to work with and against an institutional text? Working with the curriculum points to what educational research refers to as the overt curriculum, which is the learning expectations and objectives that structure student progress and assessment in a particular course or subject. And this is what teachers have to work within to introduce difficult knowledge topics. But working against the curriculum can point to other information that also informs student and teacher learning. And all this other information can be introduced through other mediums. For example, the societal or hidden curriculum. So societal curriculum is a massive, ongoing, and informal curriculum of peers, family, social media, and other socializing factors that can educate. And while on the other hand, the hidden curriculum, which is an area I'm really interested in, is how the unwritten or unofficial norms, behavior, and attitudes and also inform student learning. But it can also point to how topics are structured and ranked within the curriculum. So the information that is discussed or not discussed in the curriculum and the many factors that inform student learning can generate tensions and conflicts for teachers who are trying to approach this work in the classroom. So to frame this point, I have an interview quote from a grade 6 teacher that says, "It's already understood that the curriculum doesn't cover all perspectives of our diverse and dynamic Canadian community. The curriculum doesn't necessarily include all voices of people with intersectional identities. It's very additive. Educators can sort of choose how to deliver the topics or how they might teach them. I feel like there is room, but it takes a lot of work on the educator where you have to go out and see those connections or find stories you want to amplify." So this brings me to my next point, which is the knowledge production. So teachers are producing different kinds of knowledge based on either gaps they notice in the curriculum or informal or formal conversations they're having with students about topics, let's say, that are ambiguously defined in the curriculum. So teachers can select, create, and share resources with colleagues in person or online, which, like I mentioned, can happen through formal lesson plans or informal conversations in the hallways, assemblies, in the bathroom, or in the classroom. So teachers are not only creating lessons to meet the expectations of the overt curriculum, but they're also responding to everyday events. And in our increasingly hyper-communicated world, students could ask about the war in Ukraine, or even in our community last year, the terrorist truck attack. So on one hand, this production of knowledge expresses the autonomy of teachers being able to create and develop resources in the context that they teach. While on the other hand, it shows that approaching these topics takes a lot of time and effort and many resources and supports. So teachers are enacting other kinds of labor, mental, physical, emotional, and when they teach about these difficult knowledge topics. So this is true when the topic isn't clearly defined or is ambiguously located in the curriculum. So to frame this point, I will quote from a grade 7-8 teacher that says, "It's risky to take on these types of questions. They're emotional questions, right? These are really difficult. These are, like kids are trying to figure out their place in the world, and these things really have formative impacts sometimes for some students on how they see that." So when selecting, introducing, and discussing difficult topics that are loosely defined or there is ambiguity, this might create tensions or conflicts or resistance from teachers on how to teach about it. And these topics, as we read from Clive, are emotional, and they can be triggering and traumatic for both the students, their families, as students go home and mention these topics. And a lot of teachers like to keep transparency of what students are learning in the classroom. So this brings me to my next point, which is the role of surveillance and how teachers feel when approaching these topics. So in some instances, teaching about difficult knowledge is seen as a transgression or something that could be punishable with disciplinary measures, let's say by the Ontario College of Teachers. For example, some of these disciplinary measures could be the possibility of losing your job based on complaints received from different families, communities, external actors. And this might generate a sense of fear when teaching about difficult knowledge, and many teachers consider it a form of risk-taking. That's both what I've seen in the interviews and some data I've collected, but also from the literature. I have a quote from a grade 7-8 teacher that says, "The curriculum has many opportunities to integrate, but I don't think teachers have the capacity to understand how to do that, and also very scared too, very scared. We live in a council culture where anything you say can be held against you." So the sense of surveillance is not only coming from their immediate environment of teachers, but also what they read and observe on social media or what they see online. So for example, the publication called Professionally Speaking, particularly the section at the back called Disciplinary Summaries, has created has evoked fear or the sensation of surveillance for teachers. Because while some of these disciplinary measures are really critical to ensure student safety, because a lot of them are measures that need to take disciplinary actions, some of them are really loosely defined and ambiguous. So they can put themselves in the position of those teachers to say, I'm going to introduce this topic and it generates this emotional response. How am I supposed to treat that? So there are ambiguity in how to manage these conversations, particularly when it comes to difficult knowledge and in the classroom. So that's it for that. So some of my next research steps are to complete my interviews, continue my data analysis, which means to like either scrap some of the ideas or add to it, or, you know, understand it more deeply, and to begin writing. And I'd like to thank, references, and I'd like to thank my supervisor, Dr. Kim Clark, and my advisor, Dr. Lindsay Bell, the whole of the anthropology department, and my funding bodies. That's it.
Thank you, Sophia. Does anybody have questions? Fifi.
Thank you so much. I actually have a question about the very last article, the one about the saying that a lot of teachers are scared. I'm wondering, have a sense of who they're scared of. Like, are they scared of student reactions or someone in boards, like directors monitoring? Like, scared from the bottom or from the top?
No, thank you. Yeah, I've heard from, well, that particular participant, I remember had experienced it from things that she read online, so things that they read online, and things that hear from, you know, teachers not only in Canada, but also in the States, and those experiences that generate that fear. Also, among the participants, an interesting relation is those that are racialized teachers have experienced that they are read differently in the classroom. So the way that they interact with these topics is different compared to other teachers who are maybe stand in as allies. So that fear is structural sometimes, where other colleagues will prevent them from joining activities, from not collaborating. A lot of teacher activities are in collaboration, so they prevent them. Or because they feel that not only are they read differently, but this work is controversial, or why are you approaching teaching that way? So it could be within the school board. Also depends on the district school board. Some district school boards are like heavily in the media and they want to prevent that at any cost. So they prevent any teacher from doing any kind of external work, versus more of the other people that are supported. So it really, so that map of social relations, they get it from everywhere. Yeah.
Presentation. I had a question about your aspects. So, like, how did you approach like getting information from those sources? Did you go in with like these hashtags or Facebook groups, or you just on a given day, I'm going to start there? What kind of what was the intent behind finding this? And like, is there anything to this point?
Thanks. Yeah, no, well, I understand that well, as being a millennial, I can understand how different algorithms on different platforms work. So on Facebook, it's less about hashtags and more about groups. So there's a lot of groups on Facebook that you can join. And this is where an interesting ethics question comes in, because originally I wanted to go into private groups and to be able to, a lot of teacher groups are private, particularly at the elementary level. But, you know, that brings an ethical question of, if I wanted to observe, all those people are expecting a level of protection, you know, that information is safe. So I couldn't go into those groups, and I had to go into groups that are public, which limited my access. But it was interesting. I still was observing interactions. They invited me to the groups. I published my recruitment flyer, got direct messages from people who were interested. That was on Facebook. On Twitter is a little bit different because people are more front facing. You know, they can classify more hashtags works on that on Twitter. And it has to do with my personal profile as a researcher. So I was careful to mention in my bio, like, what am I doing? Why am I recruiting? I pinned my recruitment at the top. Also, like, ethically engage with participants, where like kind of mimicking in-person interactions, like understanding what they do, interacting with their posts, and then if they're public, interacting with them, sending them a direct message, or they would directly comment on the post. So obviously with algorithms, I'm sure I was funneled teachers who had similar thoughts, who had similar expectations of teaching. But I mean, I could interview who I got and who was interested. So that was also, I did snowballing. So I also know some teachers, told them about the research and they shared it. So that gave me the ability to also to reach retired teachers who were also, with really interestingly, also doing similar work in the early 80s to early 90s. I hope I answered your question. Yeah.
Are you able to kind of tease out the experiences of teachers from equity seeking groups as compared to teachers who are not from equity seeking groups, or is that something that you just haven't been able to do? I'm asking because my son just went back into the public school system and his school is in the right where the terrorist attack happened. So that's the community probably the most traumatized and impacted. And so, but all of the teachers are white women, like all of them, you know. And but I, you know, and I was just wondering, that's something you've been able to, like, maybe because you have a broader scope.
Yeah, that's why I've been. Are you specifically asking if I'm looking for those participants?
Are you able to get, are you
Yeah,
going to be
like,
able to?
I
include
mentioned
those
in my
voices?
recruitment that is a particular perspective that I'm wanting to hear from. And in interactions with people. And right now, out of 11, I have 4 that identify as racialized teachers. And but that's something that I also want to expand upon. I don't know how, like, also managing this in an ethical way is those complications that I'm facing, that I want whoever is interested to talk to me, but I also want to make sure that this is representative of everyone's experience. Particularly, that's why I'm interested in going more North Ontario, who have different, the communities really shape what conversations people are having. But yeah, that's really important. And that's the correlation I mentioned, that among the racialized teachers, the ones that are mentioning that the work and they position themselves in it, particularly how they're read in the room, what other conversations they're having, which is very different from white or Canadian teachers.
Follow up with me and I'd have a couple of sources for you.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. Anyone, sources.
Informants, I guess is what I mean. Like,
Yeah,
people
that'd be,
interview.
yeah, thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Zsofia.
So give me a minute while I change the tech.
While Lisa's changing that, I just want to take advantage of Fifi's question to say, if you're registered in Ontario and municipal